Okay. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Some of you know me very well, probably, and then some of you are probably seeing a fresh face for the first time. So hello, pleasure to meet you. And hopefully what I have to present to you here tonight inspires you to rethink about the history and our everyday surroundings here in what we know today as the Los Angeles Basin. It is a fascinating history, and again, I encourage you to look further into this, even after this talk, because this is supposed to be a really short one today, and I'm shoving a lot of history in. So let's go. 2 months into the American Civil War, federal troops invaded the heart of Virginia with the hopes of quelling an unthinkable but inevitable rebellion by the southern slaveholding states. As the Battle of Big Bethel raged in Hampton, Virginia in June of 1861, with no clear Union victory in sight, Washington additionally drew its attention towards contested loyalties and unsteady peace in the American Southwest. In California, the stability of Union loyalty rested on the ability of government officials to secure the support of the Spanish-speaking population. With secessionist pressures mounting in the state, the Lincoln-appointed Survey General to California, Edward Fitzgerald Beale, requested that the most respected Spanish-speaking family in their state make their loyalties known. Oh, the dramatic pause. That's hilarious. Did it froze? Did it freeze?
There's the mouse.
Okay, I guess I'm gonna have to use that. That's fine. That's what I get for saying I don't want to use it. With secessionist pressures mounting in the state, the Lincoln-appointed Survey General to California, Edward Fitzgerald Beale, asked the patriarchs of the most respected Californio family in Los Angeles, Andres and Pio Pico. He stressed an urgency to clarify the existing doubts over their position to maintain the present federal government of the United States at all hazards or favor the secession of this state. Andres Pico responded, "I elected to become a member of the Confederation, the United States, adopting the citizenship of the same, of which I am proud, that although my political opinions as previously expressed have differed from those of the Republican Party, these considerations cease in the face of the attack made against the federal government, and unconditionally and at all hazards, I am for the Union entire, to maintain which I would cheerfully offer, as a soldier my sword, and as a citizen my fortune." Pio Pico similarly responded, "I approve the energetic measures adopted by the government for the preservation at all costs of the Constitution and the Union entire." The Picos pledged their full support to the Union. Unionist and government officials alike took a deep sigh upon hearing this response. For the moment, California was secured. So a lot of my research looks at the Californio and Mexican communities within Los Angeles in the particular moment of the American Civil War. I see this moment as a time in which these Californios and Mexican Spanish-speaking populations are exerting agency rather than the previous theses that have argued that the Californios and Mexican populations are declining, that their power is being lost and therefore they have no influential role in the shaping of the state. While I argue against that, they do have influence, and the roles they played in Los Angeles during the course of the Civil War better illustrate how that played out. Who are the Californios? Well, I hope all of you here are familiar with who they are, but just a brief explanation. They're Californians who assumed this identity, who were born here in the Spanish and Mexican periods of California. They historically saw themselves as elite landowners, the descendants of Spanish nobility, the caretakers of Alta California. To other Mexicans, they saw themselves as Mexicanos de la otra banda, Mexicans of a different branch of the Mexican nation. We're not like them, we're better, right? But these regionalisms and particularisms existed all throughout Latin America, and we're not just isolated here to the northern frontier of Mexico or New Spain. As we move forward with the American acquisition of California in 1848, all of a sudden their seeming control of California is slowly dying, is being lost, right? Or at least they see it that way. And in many ways, they're right. There's this mass influx of immigrants coming to the United States from all over the world. Why are they coming here? Gold, right? The gold rush is completely changing California. Their lands are being lost, right? Land speculation. The Land Act is challenging their claims to lands that have been in their families for now 2 or more generations. So we have situations like with Andres Pico, who forms an alliance with the chivalry faction of the Democratic Party to secure the Californio power or control of California in things like the PICO Act. The PICO Act essentially was this idea to split California in half based off of the earlier proposed Missouri Compromise, forming a portion of the southern state of California, the southern portion of California, and the Arizona Territory into the new state of the Territory of Colorado, or rather the Republic of the Pacific. Now, this idea never fully went through because in 1860, there was an election, a highly contested election, and that highly contested election resulted in a civil war. And so that was kind of pushed to the side. But this alliance is very pivotal. What it shows is that they were willing to risk, in many ways, their ideals, in many ways their rights, for the sake of trying to still hold power to California. The Chivs were not always loyal to the California population. In fact, they were the ones who started questioning their rights to the land. They were the ones who started criminalizing Mexican indigenous Californio people. You could just be picked off the street and put into a jail, and in certain circumstances sold into slavery, right? Or a form of California slavery. And that's with the Greaser Laws of 1855. Again, promoted by the chivalry faction. So there's this unique contradiction that happens. As we move forward into the American Civil War, Hancock and political leaders start to recognize this, right? The Chiv faction is the slavery faction of the Democratic Party. Very pro-Confederate once the Civil War starts. So if these Californios supported this particular party or showed a strong support for them, where do their loyalties lie? And he says this quote, "When once a revolution commences, the masses of the native population will act." In that case, he's referring to the Californios, not to indigenous peoples here in California. "And they are worthy of a good deal of consideration. If they act, it will most likely be against the government." Now, Hancock, as well as his wife, understood that not only in the 1850s were the Californios leaning towards the Chiv faction of the Democratic Party or towards ideals that were anti-federalist, but even in the Mexican and Spanish eras, they were strongly against this center-hold power of Mexico City. And they would prefer native-born Californians to rule over California instead of federalist tyrants. And so as we move into the Civil War, Hancock, who was our quartermaster here in Pueblo de Los Angeles, said, uh-oh, I'm starting to get scared. Something's going to happen, right? And there's this, I don't know if it's true, I don't know the credibility of it, but there's kind of this rumor where he was so panicked, he had his wife sleep with a pistol in bed because he thought they were going to take over the little quartermaster's adobe, which I'll show you right now. That's it. It would have been located roughly where the LAPD headquarters is at today, which kind of cracks me up. Because he really kind of was, in many ways, the law enforcement of the town. We did have a sheriff, but as you will see in the next slide, he was also not loyal. Tomas Sanchez was the sheriff of Los Angeles. He and other Californios and people of Mexican or Latin American descent joined in what is known as the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles, which is the only successful free state militia to fight for the Confederacy. So a really, really unique thing, a group of about 80 to 85 men who marched all the way to Texas with Albert Sidney Johnston, who was the original commander of the Department of the Pacific. He resigned because he believed strongly in the Confederacy's ideals and defending his state. So he went out there and he marched along with the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles. Now, Tomas, he stayed here in the Pueblo to finish out his duties as sheriff, but he did have many of his men who were of the same background continue and actually fight in Texas. So Winfield Scott Hancock has very good reason to fear what these populations have. And again, what this illustrates is they have power, they have agency, and the federal government is recognizing this. That at any point, if they wanted to, they could secede from the Union and cause a revolt here in Southern California. So what happens thereafter? So the main guy who ends up becoming in charge of the Department of the Pacific, which is Brigadier General Sumner, he says there's no more danger of disaffection at this place there is more danger of disaffection at this place than any other in the state. And he was referring to the pueblo of Los Angeles. Now, it's important to understand that in Los Angeles, Lincoln was not a very popular guy. He only won 25% of the vote, 45% of the total vote went pro-slavery. As soon as the first shots were fired of the American Civil War, there were hurrahs for Jefferson Davis and hurrah for the Confederacy being shouted down the streets of LA. Places like the Bella Union Hotel were hotbeds of secessionist talk and Confederate discussions. So again, there's good reason to be concerned. Eventually we get this guy over here who's James Carleton. He was at Fort Tejon. He's now ordered to the Pueblo of Los Angeles, and they formed the very first ever Civil War camp in LA. Again, we just had a quartermaster's building. It was that little adobe. We just had that to protect LA. They realized they needed more. So they form Camp Fitzgerald. Eventually, they form a bigger camp called Camp Latham, which would have been placed in Rancho Bayona, near where Sony Picture Studios is at today in Culver City. The amount of men there raised up to 2,000 military men here, which was a very large number when you think about the population of LA at that time, which was between 3,000 and 4,000 individuals living in LA during the course of the Civil War. And you have an additional 2,000 troops to control this area. So again, you start to see there's a lot of fear regarding the populations here, and for good reason. They understand that the populations here, more particularly the Spanish-speaking populations, might not necessarily be loyal to the federal government. Eventually, they build a larger camp, which becomes a permanent installation known as the Drum Barracks, where I used to work at. This is the new quartermaster building, but there were several other buildings added to it. It's 59.4 acres of land. Donated to the federal government by Benjamin Wilson and Phineas Banning. This larger military institution would serve as the headquarters for the Southern District, which operated all military operations in Southern California and the Arizona Territory. So it governed a substantial amount of land, and this was the headquarters where all those military operations were launched from. From there, the next in command would have been the Department of the Pacific in San Francisco. Now, this is a really cool site to understand because we had actually Latinos who served here, or people who were of Californio and Mexican descent. We have the 1st Battalion of Native California Cavalry. This is Antonio de la Guerra, who was a captain in Company C of the 1st Battalion. He actually lived in the building of the Drum Barracks. If you ever visit the surviving museum, he used to live there because that was the junior officers' quarters reserved for lieutenants and captains. So that's where he resided. And eventually, post-war, a Bigsby would then move in there, which is really cool history I recommend you look into in the future. But there were these 4 major companies were predominantly stationed at Drum Barracks, but we also had some in San Jose, San Francisco, and Santa Barbara, and a few other places in California. After their training here, they would be sent out into Arizona and New Mexico to control, unfortunately, in many ways, the indigenous populations that were there. And often that meant extermination or moving into early forms of reservations. And then we also have the pushing of imperial forces back into Mexico, because Mexico is in this unique moment as well, which I'll talk about in a bit. And I also did mention they were this Native California Cavalry unit was predominantly comprised of indigenous peoples, people of Mexican descent, either recent Mexican immigrants or Mexicans who had come post 1848. and then Californios all served in this. It also had people from Europe serving in this and other parts of the world, but it was predominantly comprised of Spanish-speaking populations. And in the future, Juan de la Guerra said, "We thought we had the finest cavalry outfit in the whole country. Probably did. Such horses we had." He was very fond of his time, and so were the other members of the 1st Battalion of the Native California Cavalry. The politics during this time period are really quite unique. I already kind of mentioned some of that, being allied with the Democratic Party, and particularly with the slave faction, as a way to assume control. It was the most powerful faction in the state of California. So the belief was, again, align yourself with the most powerful group, you can then promote yourself and move yourself ahead. But as we move into the Civil War, we start to have people who criticize that. And I'm like, you shouldn't do that. And one of them is Francisco Ramirez, who was a famous journalist in LA, who published El Clamor Público, a Spanish-speaking newspaper, but he was also a political activist and politician. And Francisco, he called out the hypocrisy of people like Andres Pico and said, "It's shocking. After so many insults and affronts, one still sees the sad spectacle of Hispanic Americans supporting the slavery party with their votes." And he was very, very critical of them. And one of the reasons why he was so critical of them is he really believed in these ideals of freedom, of a liberal government, of democracy, and saw the Democrats and eventually the Confederacy as limiting those rights of equality that everybody's promised to. And more importantly, the liberties that were promised under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? And he saw those as that treaty being violated. And so you see that there at the bottom, or on the side, "We are convinced that California is lost to all Hispanic Americans. Only Mexicans alone have been sacrificed on gallows, raised to launch their poor souls into eternity. Is this the liberty and equality of the country we have adopted?" And so as we move forward, we start to see people like Andres Pico recognize these injustices, recognize what is happening. And these populations start to challenge them. They start to challenge these things. And they form community organizations like Juntas Patrióticas, or patriotic assemblies, that expressed Mexican and American nationalisms, believing and fighting for a constitutional government that believes in the freedom, the liberty of all, regardless of race, religion, or any other background that may inhibit you. And he and many others started to join in these groups. In that process, we also have the formation of holidays like Cinco de Mayo, which is a California tradition, and I mean that in its very sense. It is a California tradition, an American tradition, because Cinco de Mayo comes out of an act of resistance against these systems of oppression, as a way to proclaim that I am Mexican, but I'm also American, and we're bounded together in our journey towards freedom and a constitutional democracy. And so I brought these two flags here because they would parade down the streets of LA, holding the two flags in solidarity and saying, we believe in the ideals of the Union, we believe in the ideals of Juarez, right? Not Maximilian, not Jefferson Davis. We believe in these ideals of Lincoln and Juarez. So it's a very unique, very interesting moment that we start to see. And David Hayes Bautista, a scholar who researched and wrote a book about Cinco de Mayo, he says, he marks this period as the beginning of one of the most fertile periods in Latino community organization, matched in magnitude perhaps only by the heady days of the Chicano movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I also didn't mention this guy, but not everybody was always in favor, and I always have to show the other side too. Yeah, we can get caught in obviously the romanticism of people like Francisco Ramirez, but we also had people like Ignacio Sepúlveda. He actually believed in a lot of the ideals of the Confederacy, also of Californio descent. You've probably seen his family's name all throughout LA, right? He actually, for Mexico itself, he believed in a new European-style order. So he supported Maximilian, and when Maximilian assumed the throne, he and many other people of Mexican and California descent actually went to Mexico and joined the Imperial Army. And he became a major in the Imperial Army, served in Mexico City and Querétaro. But we also had men who were from here, of California and Mexican descent, also going out and fighting for Juarez. So you have this unique moment. And the best way to describe what is happening is, again, that expression of agency, that wanting and demanding to have a seat at the table and the way politics and society are being shaped in the 19th century, both in Mexico and the United States. I gotta cut it short. And this also just speaks to that. Uladislao Vallejo of the famous Vallejo family, he also served for Juarez. Antonio de la Guerra and Jose Ramon Pico served along the Arizona-New Mexico border, engaging in conflict with Maximilian's forces. And then we have a picture of Benito Juarez. Again, also understanding that in the American Southwest, you can't be limited by the North or South binary. In the American Southwest, this is not a story of North or South. This is a story of East and West, and indigenous peoples, and Hispanic people, and Anglo-Americans, and all these different people coming together, because this is a borderlands. This is a space that is contested, where the borders are frequently challenged and different people are trying to assert their claim to this particular land. And so understanding this region as a borderlands, you understand the transnational fluidity that these people were involved with, right? Being involved with both the creation of the new modern Mexican nation, as well as simultaneously with the creation of a new American state as well. Because both wars happening, whether south of the border or north of it, were wars to see what kind of nation are we going to be moving forward, right? But also in the midst of all this chaos, something terrible happens, right? And this question came out of an animal studies class that I took with Professor Brett Mizell at CSULB. And the question that I asked myself is, what is a vaquero without his vacas? What is a ranchero without his rancho? And those are real questions that Californios had to grapple with, especially in the midst of the Civil War. Why? What major event happened?
Drought.
The drought, right? And it's an everyday, real life thing for us Californians even today, right? And it may get worse, but the drought makes it so much worse for these populations at this particular time. What is a vaquero without his vacas, right? It kills this cattle industry that especially flourished during the midst of the gold rush, as we've known from the history taught here at the Rancho, right? But now what do we do, right? And so what ends up happening is, unfortunately, a lot of land is lost, a lot of money is lost. Many rancheros, many vaqueros, unfortunately, have to go further into poverty if they weren't in a state of poverty already. But I also, because I like to be somewhat of an optimist, and I want to also show the agency that these communities expressed, we also see a shifting in the way in which they operated and managed their ranchos, right? We have a movement not towards, new cattle, but towards sheep, right? As we see with this rancho itself, right? And it's also being done in Spanish-speaking ranchos as well, where people like Manuel Dominguez, who owned Rancho San Pedro, he was able to save his rancho because he switched over to using sheep. He also diversified his lands. He sold some to the railroad and Phineas Banning, right, for the one we got in 1869. He also started to sell some for the development of the port, and slowly started to make his profits. And he actually died a wealthy man, which isn't very common for a lot of these Californios, right? But we also see that happening among women. We have a lot of women assuming control of these ranchos and also expressing that similar agency, being very creative and wise in the ways in which they manage their ranch lands, because they either inherited it from their husbands or it's a land that they inherited from their parents or grandparents that now they have to take care of. People like Arcadia Bandini, who later on, not necessarily in the Civil War period, became one of the wealthiest California women or California women in the later 19th century because of her efforts of being a successful landowner. But we also see new jobs start to come out. Los Angeles is modernizing. So we have, instead of being a vaquero, you're now a sheep shearer, right? Or you're working in the new factories that are popping up. We have a railroad. We have the development of the port. So there's all these new jobs that Californios and Spanish-speaking communities are now shifting towards, are expressing themselves in new ways to, again, assert their agency and survive, and in the process form the modern Los Angeles that we get in the 20th century. And I think Carlos Salomon best illustrates this time period, and particularly the roles of Californios post the American acquisition. He says this of Pio Pico, but I feel that you could impose this upon the larger community as a whole and recognize the people living in Los Angeles or living throughout Southern California that were either of California or Mexican American descent can be a symbol of Mexican American self-determination. And I believe strongly in every single thing that's said there. Mexican American being one, right? Understanding the duality, the transnationalisms that shaped their identity in the later 19th century, but also self-determination, right? The idea that even in the midst of horrendous situations, even as we are criminalized, as our lands are stolen from us, as our cattle are dying, we still keep moving forward and playing a role in the shaping of California and the United States. And that's where I leave you. And I'm sorry it's so short, but I really hope that I've kind of like nudged, those thought bubbles, and they keep going, and that I encourage you to dig further into this, okay? So thank you.
You did a good job.
Did anybody have any questions for
Yes.
Brian? No, you can't get away with that.
I'm already like over time.
Well, did you see anybody jumping up and saying we want to go?
Okay.
Really quick question about the Constitution, because California's Constitution was done both in Spanish, both Spanish and English.
Yes, correct.
And it was a very long period of time until that happened. And do you know the history of exactly what it was that changed? I know it was the gold rush part, but do you have any information on how that actually got wiped out and just turned into English? I was always wanting to know how that actually happened.
Are you saying how it evolved, how it changed?
Well, no, because it was developed in bilingual. We were a bilingual state, and we
initially,
and it was like that for 10 or 20 years, and then all of a sudden it changed. But you don't know.
I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry.
Really, none of it's like it's always been something that's baffling me. I can't figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, they did have Californios participating in the creation of that early constitution, and it was a bilingual constitution. You are correct. And people like Manuel Dominguez, who at the time he was known as El Indio because he was a little bit darker skinned, like myself, but he participated in the creation of that, and so did a lot of local men in this area. That were, again, of that similar historical background. But I don't know too much of the history thereafter. Yeah, so I apologize. I'm pretty sure it's in bilingual now, again, because you could read it probably in every language, hopefully. At least I think the state of California would have it in every language.
Not officially.
Yeah, I know.
They're officially a bilingual state. That's the thing, and then it stopped. And it's just really interesting to see what...
So sorry, I don't have that direct answer.
Any other questions? Okay, we have one final treat for you tonight. Thank you, Brian. Wasn't that wonderful? Our new curator, sort of new. He's been here for about 2 months now. Carlos Ortega, welcome.
I thought that this would be a wonderful opportunity to present myself, and I see some familiar faces already and some others that are new. So I am the last thing between you and a warm home, so I promise I'll be brief.
It's on the.
Here we go. All right. So I just want to very briefly go through my background and the past projects I worked on, the exhibition principles that I believed in, and the goals for the future here at Rancho. So this accent is from Spain. I'm from northern Spain, close to the border with France. I studied art history and I have a master in museum studies at the University of Leicester in the UK, and I also studied in Germany. So I came to the US in 2003. I started working at the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach. I thought I would stay a year or two, but they offered me a job and I stayed much longer, and I ended up working for after 4 years, I worked for a for-profit company called BRC Imagination Arts. And what they do is they create, design, and produce exhibitions, theme parks, attractions, cultural heritage sites all over the world. And the first project they put me in charge of as project development manager was for the Vatican, where we went to Israel and we developed 2 pilgrimage centers, one in Israel and the other one in Galilee, where the challenge that the Vatican was facing was that when pilgrims would go to the holy sites, the tour guide wasn't always Roman Catholic. So they wanted to create a center that would recreate and explain all the events that took place in each holy site. And then that way, once the Catholic pilgrims would go through it, they would go to the holy site and it wouldn't matter so much what story they were getting from the tour guide. After that project, this is at the Museum of Liverpool in the UK. We did a small exhibition about the Industrial Revolution. And this is another project at the Kennedy Space Center in Orlando. This is the Space Shuttle launch experience, where we sat down with 13 astronauts to recreate all the rattles and shakes that they feel when they're sent to space, and we created a simulator. And this one is for the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, a small exhibition about space exploration. So the greatness of working at a company like this was that all my co-workers came from very diverse backgrounds. So we had people that came from theaters, from Hollywood, that they came from museums and theme parks, and they created a platform where we were allowed to grab an idea from a theme park and apply it to a museum, or something from the theater and apply it to the theme park. Everything was valid and everything was okay. So with all this, there are 3 principles that I learned with them that I truly believe in the creation of any exhibition, either in a for-profit or non-profit. And those principles that I believe in is that the first one is that any exhibition has to be visual before verbal. So visuals capture your attention and lead you to the text. Exhibits and shows must be selected and staged so that the basic idea and emotional meaning comes across strictly from the visual experience. The second principle is that an exhibition has to be emotional before intellectual. Take people on an emotional journey. Emotional engagement can produce unforgettable experiences that extend to a lifetime of learning. And the last principle is education is a very important factor of the work that museums do. And it's key in the development of any project. But a lot of museums forget about inspiration, because it is not about trying to give a PhD of information in 25 minutes of visit. It's about inspiring your visitors to learn more about the subject matter. And if you inspire them, they will do their research on their own, they'll do a Google search, or they'll buy a book at the store, and that'll be already a success. I think it's Plutarch who says, education is less like filling a bucket, and it's more like lighting a fire. And I grabbed all these learnings from the for-profit, and then I went back to museums, and I started working in museums, and I went back to the Museum of Latin American Art of America, and in a different capacity, and creating exhibitions following these principles. So now here at El Rancho, we have the past history of El Rancho, and we have our audience today. And what we want is to take the Rancho's past and pass it to this audience, and have the audience reflect and look back into history. And that's all thanks to volunteers like you. You know, when I think about it, and talking to you earlier, so many of you have spent so much time and passion into this place. And the truth of the matter is that this place belongs to you more than anybody else. And it's because of people like you that this institution survives and thrives. And so what I'm trying to do now as the new curator at El Rancho, I'm just trying to raise the profile of the institution by creating engaging exhibitions that are relevant to people and to the audiences today. And I also, again, want to thank you all, because this, well, I promise it will be short, so this is short. But I'm more than happy to, my doors are always open. I love to have people stop by, and I would love to talk to you all more and hear your experiences with the visitors, what works best and not. And just to let you know that I truly appreciate what you do. And you are the key element between the visitors and the history of the institution. So it's you who make the experience engaging to them. So thank you.